Aayita had grown used to being looked at differently ever since she was a child. She grew faster than the other Apache girls, taller, broader shoulders, stronger arms, while the women in the tribe were learning to be gentle and to bow their heads. Aayita was learning to carry heavier water buckets, haul wood farther, and endure longer. People said she was too much like a man, that a woman like her would never be loved. White people looked at her differently too, but not with fear. It was a mix of curiosity and contempt. They whispered behind her back, mocking her height and frame. Two worlds, two communities, and Aayita belonged to neither. At 25 years old, Aayita entered a marriage that both sides would call a mistake. Jacob Caldwell, a widowed rancher living alone on the prairie, was not looking for the perfect woman. He was just looking to make his house feel a little less empty, and Aayita, with all her differences, said yes, not out of hope, but because she was simply too tired of standing alone. That afternoon, after a plain wedding ceremony, the wind swept through the dry grass behind the horse stables. Ada sat there, her hands clenching the buckskin dress. When Jacob walked toward her, she did not pull away, but the tears came anyway. Unstoppable, she leaned her head against his chest, her tall frame trembling like a child who had endured too much for too long. Her voice broke into sobs as she whispered, "It hurts so much. I can't bear it." Jacob wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time he truly felt that this woman's pain was not on her skin. It was buried in 25 years of rejection and a heart that had never been allowed to believe it was worthy of love. Night fell over the Caldwell ranch in a thick, heavy silence. Inside the small wooden house, the fireplace crackled steadily, casting a soft orange glow against walls faded by the years. Aayita stood by the bed, her large hands gripping the hem of her buckskin dress. She was taller than most of the women Jacob had ever known, broad, shouldered, solidly built, and at that moment all of that strength seemed to vanish. She could not bring herself to meet his eyes. "Jacob." Her voice trembled. I am scared." Jacob set down the oil lamp and slowly stepped closer, careful to keep some distance, as if afraid to startle her. He said nothing. He just waited. Ida drew in a deep breath, and then the words she had buried for 25 years came rushing out like a dam breaking. She spoke of the mocking eyes back in the tribe, the whispered words saying she was not truly a woman. She told him about the men who had looked at her with ridicule, comparing her body to a warrior's, to a man's, as if her appearance were a sin. "They always said the first night would hurt," she said softly, her voice breaking, "that someone like me would only bring disappointment." She looked up at Jacob for the first time, and in her eyes was raw, unhidden fear. "I am scared you will regret seeing me, scared. You will think you married the wrong person." Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Standing before him was not the strong woman people talked about, but a soul worn thin by a lifetime of judgment. He stepped closer, slow enough for Aayita to back away if she needed to, but she did not move. He reached out, not touching her right away. "Aayita," he said gently, his voice low and steady, "I did not marry you because you reminded me of anyone else. I married you because you are you." She trembled as he lightly placed a hand on her arm. It was not a possessive gesture, but a request for permission. Ada's breath caught. Then she gave a small nod. "I am afraid of the pain," she whispered. "Afraid." "My body is wrong." Jacob drew her into his arms, letting her rest her forehead against his chest. "If tonight is just talking," he said, "that is enough. I am not in a hurry." "I am not going anywhere." Aayita closed her eyes. In the flickering firelight, for the first time in her life, she felt her fear being heard, not mocked, not dismissed. And though the night was still long, Aayita began to understand something small, but deeply important. Maybe for once she did not have to endure it alone. Jacob did not rush to touch Aayita. He simply sat down on the wooden chair beside the fireplace, letting the silence spread on its own. The way one might give a frightened horse time to calm itself, the firelight flickered in his gray eyes, steady, calm, and without judgment. "You know," he said slowly, "my late wife, she used to think she was not good enough either." Ada opened her eyes in surprise. Jacob rarely spoke about the woman he had lost. His voice grew softer, not heavy with sorrow, but colored with a quiet kind of remembrance that had learned how to rest. She was small, gentle, but always afraid she did not deserve anyone. Before she passed, she held my hand and said something I have never forgotten. Jacob looked into the fire. Kindness is the only thing that matters. Then he turned to Aayita, his gaze unwavering. I have lived by those words ever since. Aayita felt her throat tighten. No man had ever spoken to her like that, without pity, without curiosity, only with simple respect. Jacob stood up and stepped closer. Then he stopped. "I do not want you to endure anything else," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever." He reached out again, this time brushing the back of her hand. Aayita did not pull away. His hand was warm, steady, and sure. "I will make it easy," he whispered. "We go at your pace. We stop whenever you want." Those words felt like gentle rain on the parched land inside Aayita. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat slow for the first time in what felt like forever. "You do not have to be different," Jacob continued. "You do not have to be smaller. You do not have to be softer. I have lived alone for too long, and I need someone who can stand beside me." Ada lowered her head, resting her forehead against his chest. This time she did not cry. She only let out a long breath, as if setting down a burden she had carried her whole life. "I never thought," she said softly, "that someone would wait for me." Jacob wrapped his arms around her, holding her close but not too tight. "I am here," he said, "and I will wait as long as it takes." In that old wooden house, with a crackle of fire and the night wind outside, Aayita began to understand something she had never been taught. Gentleness did not make her weak. It allowed her to be herself. That night passed slowly, as if even time understood there was no need to rush. The fire in the hearth dimmed, leaving only glowing embers. Jacob laid a thick blanket across the bed, then stepped back, letting Aayita decide on her own. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of her own breath. Then very gently she stepped forward, not because she felt pushed, but because for the first time in her life she felt safe near a man. They lay next to each other, nothing more. Jacob rested his arm behind her back. He drew in a quiet breath like he was wrestling with something inside. "I have been waiting a long time," he admitted, his voice dropping low. Then he caught himself. "I am sorry. I did not mean to make you feel pressured." He stayed close enough for her to know he was there, but never held too tightly. Aayita turned toward him, hesitating for a beat, then laid her head against his chest. Her tall, strong body remained tense, as if bracing for something to go wrong, but nothing did. There was only warmth, only the steady beat of Jacob's heart beneath her ear. Only his hand resting gently on her arm, fingers slowly brushing across the soft buckskin fabric. Unhurried, careful, "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Aayita nodded, then whispered, almost surprised at herself. Jacob gently tightened his arm, not to possess, but to reassure. "Then tonight," he said, "let this be enough." They talked for hours about the prairie during drought, about the mornings Jacob woke up alone for years, about Aayita's childhood, where she always had to be stronger than necessary. Jacob listened without interrupting, without correcting her story. Now and then he leaned down to press a soft kiss on her forehead, not a promise, not a request, just presence. "You are not too much, Aayita," Jacob whispered in the dark. "I have lived among wind and stone my whole life. I need someone strong enough to stand with me." Aayita closed her eyes. Those words reached deeper than anything she had ever heard. She shifted slightly closer and wrapped her large arms around him, awkward, hesitant, but real. That night they crossed no lines, but in that closeness Aayita felt something she never had before. Her body was no longer something to defend. It was simply a place she was allowed to be, and for the first time sleep came without fear. I am truly grateful to have you here. The voice continues softly. If this story brought back something for you those dusty evenings, the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, consider subscribing to my channel so each day we can sit together again and I will tell you another story from the West. Morning arrived more gently than Aayita had ever imagined. Soft sunlight slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters, touching her face like a tentative greeting. She opened her eyes, startled for a brief second, then remembered where she was. In Jacob's home, in the arms of a man who was still asleep, breathing steadily, who had not left when the night came to an end. The feeling warmed her chest in a strange and unfamiliar way. Aayita shifted slightly, careful not to break whatever fragile thing had settled between them. Jacob opened his eyes, not startled, just smiling. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and raspy. She nodded, then almost without realizing, smiled back. A small smile, one that had never found its way to her face when she was near others. Jacob sat up, stoked the fire, and began boiling water for coffee. He moved slowly, never turning his back for too long, as if to make sure she was still all right. They ate breakfast in a comfortable silence. No one forced a word. When Jacob returned to her side, Aayita suddenly reached out and lightly touched his arm. A brief touch, but it was hers to give. Jacob stopped immediately. "Is that okay?" he asked. "Yes," Aayita whispered. "I just wanted to try." He nodded, letting her lead every step. Ada touched him again, this time for longer, feeling the warmth through the rough fabric of his shirt. She was no longer trembling like the night before. What remained was a cautious curiosity, like someone stepping into water for the first time after a long cold winter. They sat closer together. Every touch remained slow, layered with fabric, never rushed. Jacob did not guide her, did not push. He was simply there, responding when she reached out, pausing. Whenever she tensed, "You can say stop anytime," he reminded her. "And I will listen," and this time Aayita believed him. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing deeply, taking in the scent of wood, of smoke, of a place that felt safe. The fears that had taken root in her did not vanish, but they no longer controlled every breath. "I never thought," she said softly, "that my body could be something other than a burden." Jacob gently squeezed her hand. "It is not," he said. "It is part of you, and you are enough." Aayita closed her eyes. In that moment, fear gave way to something new. Not bravery, but permission to believe, and from there, first steps of discovery felt lighter than they ever had before. That afternoon faded slowly, as if the prairie itself were holding its breath. Golden sunlight angled through the wooden window, casting a warm, gentle hue across the room. Aayita stood by the window, gazing out at the swaying grass. In the wind, her back was straight, but no longer tense. The strength in her posture remained, but this time it did not carry the weight of defense. Jacob stood behind her, close enough for her to feel his warmth, but not touching. He had learned the most important lesson in the hours they had shared. Waiting could also be an act of love. Aayita turned around. Her eyes no longer looked away. There was still a trace of nervousness, but beneath it was true readiness, not born of obligation, not driven by fear of being left behind. "I think I am ready," she said softly, if you are still here." Jacob nodded. "I am here. No grand promises, no rush, just presence." They moved toward each other slowly, every motion exchanged through glances, through breath. Jacob let Aayita lead the rhythm. When she paused, he paused. When she moved forward, he followed. Everything unfolded in a silence full of respect where no one had to endure, and no one was taken further than they were ready to go. Aayita closed her eyes, listening to her body, not to resist, but to feel, and what surprised her most was not the closeness, but the safety. There was no pain like the whispered warnings had told her for years. There was only warmth, only connection, like two pieces of land finally meeting after a long drought. When everything settled, Aayita rested her head against Jacob's chest, her breath still trembling softly. A single tear rolled down, but this time it was not from hurt. "You really made it easy," she whispered, her voice breaking from relief. Jacob held her, his hand steady on her back. "It was not me," he answered gently. "It was you." You were brave enough to believe. Aayita smiled, a smile unlike any she had ever known before. No strain, no hesitation, and in that moment she understood something she had never believed possible. For the first time in her life, she did not have to suffer to be loved. She only had to be herself. Summer passed, and the first days of autumn touched the prairie. The grass grew thicker, the winds softened, and the Caldwell ranch was no longer as quiet as it once was. Aayita placed a hand on her belly, a gesture still new, still tentative, but deeply instinctive. She wore traditional Apache clothing with its raw stitching and familiar earth tones. Her tall, strong frame remained unchanged, powerful as ever, but her eyes were different. No more avoiding, no more lowered gaze. She stood tall, shoulders wide, like someone who had finally reclaimed her place on this earth. They rode in town together on a bright morning. The familiar stares returned, curious, whispering, doubtful. Some paused in their work when Aayita walked by. Some glanced at her belly, then quickly turned away, as if refusing to believe what they were seeing. Jacob held her hand, not tightly, not pulling, just steady presence. Aayita squeezed back, feeling the strength pass between them. She had nothing to hide. She needed no one's permission to exist. In front of the general store, a white woman looked at Aayita for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Just a slight motion, but enough for Aayita to understand. The world would not change in a day, but it could begin. They left town as the sun climbed higher. Out in the fields behind the ranch, Jacob stopped his horse and turned to Aayita. No one else was around, just the wind and the wide open sky. He placed a hand on her belly and leaned in to kiss it softly, not as a declaration, but as an acknowledgement. "Are you all right?" he asked. Aayita smiled, a full smile, unhidden. "I have never been more all right than I am now." She looked out over the prairie once, a place where she had felt so lost. Now it stretched before her like a welcome. She thought of the years she had been called too different, of the fears that once gripped her heart. And then she placed her hand over Jacob's, steady. "I do not need to be smaller," she said quietly. "I just need to be loved the right way." Jacob kissed her forehead, the wind lifting Ada's thick black hair. In the middle of the open grassland, they stood not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to live, and for the first time Aayita knew something for certain. Confidence does not come from changing who you are, it comes from being with someone who makes you stop hiding from yourself. She knew her body was changing, and this time she was not afraid. Autumn came early that year. The wind rolled across the prairie, carrying the scent of damp soil and freshly cut grass. The Caldwell ranch had not changed much. The same old wooden house, the same low fences, the same vast sky with nothing to shield you from it. But Aayita knew that something had changed forever. She sat on the porch steps, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the small movements inside. Each flutter was a reminder. Her body was not something to endure or to hide. It was where life began. Jacob sat beside her, quiet as always. They no longer needed many words. Some things only needed presence. Aayita thought back to the words that had followed her for a quarter of a century. "You're too much, too tall, too strong, too different." Those words had once made her believe that love always came with pain, that if she did not endure, she would be left behind. But Jacob had never measured her, not by height, not by blood, not by the expectations of either world. He had done one simple thing. He made space for her to stay. Ada turned to him that day. She said softly, "When I said I can't bear it, I thought I was talking about the pain." Jacob smiled, his eyes soft, and now, Aayita answered, "I understand. I was just carrying that pain alone for too long." Jacob placed his hand gently over hers. Not to hold, not to keep, just to be there. She looked out across the prairie where the sun was slowly setting, painting everything gold, and in that moment Aayita understood that real love does not arrive to change who we are. It comes to give us permission to be ourselves without paying for it in pain. Their story was not a fairy tale. That town still held eyes that had not yet learned to see differently. The world still clung to its rigid mold. But in that small wooden house, Aayita no longer had to shrink herself to fit into any of them, and the message their life left behind was so simple it was almost unbelievable. Real love does not measure in inches or bloodlines. It does not demand endurance. It makes room. Jacob did not save Aayita from who she was. He simply stood still long enough for her to walk out of her fear on her own, and sometimes that is the most healing thing love can do. Dear friend, the love between Aayita and Jacob was never loud or showy. It was built on patience, on the wisdom of stopping at the right moments, on listening instead of taking. Jacob did not love Aayita because she made herself smaller, weaker, or different. He loved her because she was herself, and Aayita learned this. True love does not ask you to suffer in order to be worthy. When you love the right person, you do not have to force yourself to fit. You just need to stay and be yourself. It has been a true joy to share this journey with you. I sincerely hope you find peace and happiness wherever you are. I love you, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Please let me know how this story made you feel. Leave a comment down below. Type the number 2 if this story touched your heart, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful tale from the Wild West.